Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin. Today, I'm going to talk with my friend Tren. Hello, Tren.
Hi, everyone. This is Chen. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. And it's great to be here with you around today to talk about Rose's book.
Yeah. So this is our second episode on Gillian Rose's book, Hegel Contra Sociology. In the first episode, we discussed briefly discussed the general structural similarities that Rose finds between Kant, new Kantian thinkers in the domain of philosophy and sociology that come after Kant, and in what sense the structural flaws that exist in Kant's system also exist in the sociological thought of the 19th and 20th century that rests on the presuppositions that Kant himself agrees with. Although the new Kantian tradition frames itself as a reaction to Kant, as a modification of Kant, and sometimes an utter rejection of Kant, what Rose emphasizes throughout the book is that when it comes to the basic methodological commitments, these approaches are not very different. Even the ones that appropriate Hegel, say the Frankfurt School, or Marx and Marxists, sociologists and thinkers, they do not really appreciate the move that Hegel has made against Kant, that unlike all of these neo-Kantian reactions to Kant, actually targets the very core of Kantian thought. And what Rose is trying to do is to make way for a Hegelian alternative, that Hegelian alternative in general, but in terms of the sociological implications of this, Hegelian alternative when it comes to concepts such as concept of society and individuality, that is immune to the problems of Kantianism. She also addresses this problem the alternative as a noun-foundationalist alternative to the duality, the dichotomy between rationalism and nihilism. That's what she thinks happens in philosophical and sociological thinking after Kant. What we emphasize on in the first episode was the problem of method, how this attack on Kant coming from Hegel, one of the main targets, one of the main points is the question of method. And we briefly discussed how this methodological structure not only exists in Kant and in philosophy, but also in the sociological thinking of thinkers ranging from Durkheim to Habermas. And what we have extracted from Rose's approach is that at the center of the problem of Kantian and neo-Kantian methodology is the problem of buffering and self-buffering of reason from the inquiry. And as a result of that buffering, there is a problem with pre-establishing the relations between conceptual pairs without really letting any examination reach those original oppositions and repair them and remodify them. In other words, some concepts in Kantian and new Kantian systems are fixed and unchangeable, although the relationship between these concepts and what comes in between them changes based on the thinker. But the structure of buffering some concepts, buffering, for instance, the reason that is examining reason from the examination, is something that is shared. And what Hegel's alternative looks like, what happens in Hegel, according to Rose, is that Hegel not only departs from Kantian method, and as a result evades the problem of new Kantian thinking as well, but also he avoids using a method in a usual sense of the word. It's not that Hegel starts with a method the same way that Kant starts with a method, according to Rose. And we wondered in our discussion what that really means and what it means to evade the method, what it means to not impose the method in the form of a schema on the subject matter, and what kind of problems emerge as a result of that. And one of the main themes that we probably are going to come back to when we start talking about Hegel's logic later in these episodes is the nature of contradiction or inconsistency. What determines the inconsistency of a shape of a spirit or a shape of consciousness in the course of the analysis? So that was about the question of a method. What we're going to focus on today is another side of this problem, which is very much connected to the problem of method that Rose identifies in Kantian and neo-Kantian thinking. And we call this the problem of dichotomic thinking. According to Rose, there is another similarity between Kant and his neo-Kantian errors in philosophy and sociology. And that is very much about the relationship that is established about within concepts with respect to their relationship, what kind of a relationship they have, and what kind of relationship they could have, or better said, they should have. So, as I briefly mentioned in the introductory part, what is similar in these approaches, according to Rose, is that Kant and hers assume opposition between various pairs of concepts. This could be between morality and nature, which happens in Kant, value and validity that we see in Weber and Durkheim in sociology, and concepts and intuitions, that is also something that is part of more the theoretical aspect of Kant's philosophy. The second thing that happens is that just like the method, just like the examining reason was buffered from examination, these assumptions, this assumption of this original distinction between these concepts is also buffered, right? Which means that these concepts become fixed and immune to any sort of radical reconsideration. What gets reconsidered, and it definitely does in Kant's system, for instance, is the relationship between these concepts, right? How the self is related to the world, or how the concepts are related to the intuitions. But the analysis itself, the way it's done, doesn't make it possible for any sort of fundamental reconsideration of what concepts are or what intuitions are. That itself is not a rejection of what, for instance, Kant or Weber assert. It's about showing that this impossibility of reconsideration makes their claim rather shaky and open to skeptical criticism. Because if the original position that we have about the relation between morality and nature, or value and validity, or concepts or intuitions cannot be changed, that means that something very basic about this system is just simply assumed, simply presupposed, simply smuggled to the system instead of being established. And that's what Hegel is going to be all about, how to establish these concepts and their meaning and their relations. So if we have these kind of fixed relations, immune to radical reconsideration, the next move the Kantians and neo-Kantians are actually very good at is to find a way to bridge these concepts. That we have value systems, then we have the question of validity. Then how the question of validity is related to the question of values, right? In a similar fashion that Trent was talking about disciplines in the last episode, that any sort of honoring interdisciplinary studies or cross-disciplinary analysis of a subject matter has its own values. But what is happening there is that the distinction between the disciplines has been already decided. It hasn't been examined. That has been treated as a given. Now, if you want to understand religion, for instance, we're going to have a cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary analysis of religion, using philosophy as an autonomous discipline and sociology as an autonomous discipline, and so on and so forth. The same thing happens with the particular concepts here, that there is an attempt for connection, but that connection is itself rests on this predetermined distinction between these concepts. Now, in the case of Kant that I am more familiar with, this shows itself with the relation between self-consciousness and the phenomenal world. This relativization of one to the other is best exemplified in the theoretical reason, in the theoretical part of Kant's system, in how Kant finds a relationship between self-consciousness and the phenomenal world, but that connection is just done through absolute relativization. So very briefly, to just give a better a sense of what we mean and Rosa seems to mean by this kind of one-sided relativization, is that Kant raises against rationalism and empiricism, and rationalists are good at establishing the self, but they cannot bridge the self to the world, to the empirical world. The empiricists are good at getting at the world as this empirically given entity, but not able to establish any coherent concept of the self. Now, Kant, one of the main things that Kant does in the Critique of Pure Reason is that, okay, we have the self, we have the empirical world, and these traditions are not able to find a connection between the two. My project is to show you what is the connection between the two. You cannot have one without the other. But the way this is done at the end is that to have any coherent experience of a complex object, there needs to be a synthetic activity on the side of the subject in applying pure concepts to the spatially temporally ordered intuitions. In other words, one must apply concepts to some intuitions that don't have any form of experience, they cannot be experienced, before one can experience them. So in this sense, what we experience is relativized to this activity of self-consciousness in applying concepts of understanding to spatial temporally given intuitions. This, of course, bridges these two worlds. There is no empirically quote-unquote given experience without the activity of self-consciousness to synthesizing that experience. But this also causes a different type of problem. Now the world is subsumed under the activity of self-consciousness, which is what motivates Kant to think about the distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. This is just the phenomenal world that is subsumed under self-consciousness. We need to just posit another world that is the noumenal world, and the rest of that is story. So that's just one example that we are not actually going to focus on, but I wanted to mention this so that our focus is going to be in the practical domain and the relation between morality and ethical world. But I want to say that the same issue exists in the theoretical part. It's these are just examples of that very fundamental issue that is both exemplified in the general term of dichotomic thinking, and the dichotomic thinking itself is the problem with the method. So what we are going to focus on in the rest of this episode is a very specific relationship that exists, that has the same type of structure. And this is more so clear in Kant's story, but as we're going to see, Rose finds this structural problem in different territories that seem to be very different, but they are not actually at their core very different. The relationship here, the structural problem that I have introduced so far, emerges in making the moral ought a priority, the standard, over the existing relations of the ethical life. This is, in the German, using the German, is to making the moral Sollen the dominant force that subsumes the ethical life, that is Sitte. So the relationship between Sollen, the art, and Sitte, the ethical life, is something that's going to be at the center of what we're going to talk about. And as this is about this dominance relationship between the Sollen and Sitte, we can talk about this structural problem as the problem of the tyranny of the Sollen. And we're going to talk about this in different contexts. Tren, do you have something to add to this introductory notes?
Not exactly. I think you did a brilliant job of both recapping what we covered in our first episode and then provided a very clear roadmap for what we're going to talk about in this episode. So basically, Rose, our reading of Rose and our synthesis of Rose, that is that she, in her reading of Hegel, identifies as three very interesting and in our eyes, interconnected examples to showcase how this, what you mentioned, the problem of dichotomic thinking necessarily give rise to the so-called the tyranny of the Sollen. But it might be very helpful for us to perhaps first to provide a very concrete, intimate example to orient our listeners to what she really means with the term Sollen and Sitte. Can you perhaps think of a day-to-day example to showcase how is the ethical life differentiated and separated from that moral sense of ought or should Sollen, please?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a good idea. And as we move on, other examples will pop up. But I think the view that could help, which doesn't need to be Kantian, it could be even like, Stoic thinking also could have the same type of a structure. So the idea is that in finding the standard of action, right, I will only refer to something like conscience. That could be an example, right? To understand what is the right thing to do, right? Let's say I am an individual living in the United States and I want to see what is the right thing to do. If I start thinking about answering that question in the sense that, okay, what is right to do has nothing to do with what kind of social relations actually exist in the United States in the 21st century. It doesn't matter that our state has this shape. It doesn't matter that, when we see each other in the US, what kind of norms exist in that interaction. It doesn't matter that military is structured in this way. It doesn't matter that you have Christmas. None of those customs, norms, and patterns of behavior matter. The answer to the question of what is right and what is wrong should come independently from any positive reference to those existing conditions. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily they might, come together, right? I might find a social relation in the American society of 21st century actually valid morally, in the sense that it's the right thing to do. Let's say the professionalism, whatever, in like different areas of academia, that might end up being something morally valid, something right, something valuable. But the value of it, establishing the rightness or wrongness of it, is independent from any existing social relations. That also means that a man with conscience that holds this perspective would be absolutely indifferent to what kind of a society that person is living in. It doesn't matter what society one lives in, because one's standard must be fixed, must have a different source, right? So if we go to Pakistan, right, then go to Afghanistan, then go to Sweden, and then come back to United States, if we are holding this superior position for moral conscience, a value standard that is independent from the randomness of the social and ethical relations, then our actions shouldn't be any different. It doesn't matter that bribery is absolutely widespread in Pakistan and you cannot really function without bribery. If you are a moral person, you should be absolutely indifferent to those social relations. It doesn't matter that Afghanistan has a very tribal society and social relations are based on that. The same way that you act in Afghanistan should be, the way that you act in Afghanistan should be exactly the same that you act in Sweden. It doesn't matter. That part doesn't matter. So what does that say indirectly? A couple of things. One of which is that the rightness and wrongness of actions should be established independently from the existing social relations. The standard is not in conversation with the Sitte, with the ethical relations in the Hegelian language. Second thing is, because the standard is not in conversation with the ethical relations, the ethical relations cannot contribute in any way to how things should be done. Whatever that societal structure is, this should, this ought, this sollen that comes from this moral standard, comes from the conscience, should dominate whatever existing social relations exist. So if the moral conscience and the value standard, which I'm not talking about its details, that could be, I'm just talking about the structure of it. This could take many, many shapes. If that moral conscience, for instance, says that individual property rights is moral, respecting private property rights is something moral, then it doesn't matter that Afghanistan, the society, Afghanistan has a very different conception of what a property is. That doesn't matter. We now should enforce, and this is a very important verb, I think, enforce that true and right order that comes from this moral sensibility and apply it to that society. That society is wrong because we have the source of the right somewhere else, somewhere that is absolutely independent from the social relations. Right? So this could take many, many shapes, and it doesn't even need to present itself as something moral, as we're going to see in a second, although its essence is moral in the sense of imposing a sollen that derives its legitimacy from somewhere independent from the existing social relations of any given society. And the three examples, so what Rose does is, first of all, this term of the tyranny of the sollen is our invention. She doesn't talk about it in this sense, but she talks about the sollen over and over again. But she, as we discussed last time, the way that the book works is that she looks at different texts that Hegel, from young Hegel, mature Hegel, famous texts, non-famous texts. And in all of those cases, Rose finds examples of this structure. And remember what Rose is doing at the core of what she's doing. She wants to say that the problem with Kant is not the problem with Kant at all. It's a problem that is far more basic. Kant is someone who represents that. The highest intellectual representation of that problem is Kant. In sociology, that problem exists as much as it exists in Christianity, as much as it exists in French Revolution. And as a matter of fact, these are going to be the territories that we're going to talk about. The French Revolution, Christianity, and Kantian morality. How the tyranny of the sollen shows itself in these different territories. How it wears different disguises while maintaining the same structure. Do you have anything to add, Tran?
No, I just very briefly would like to draw a connection between what we done so far, the Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment debate, and what you just covered, the so-called the tyranny of the zone. That is, think about why thinkers like Vico, Hamann, and Herder will be really offended or insulted in front of Kantian proposition of we have a unquestionable taken starting point, and then we can use that, which ultimately comes from one's self-consciousness, use that as a blueprint to structure social relationship. It would just be absurd and idiotic for those three counter-enlightenment thinkers, because individuals did not merge, or consciousness did not merge out of the blue, out of nothing, but rather they are informed by the very social relationships that give it a shape, which itself tried to dominate and regulate universally. So that's the core problem. To repeat again, between the correlation between the dynamic between universal and the individual on one hand, and the Zolan and Zeta on the other. So I think there's the intellectual trajectory of this and the episode series, it should seem very evident or clear at this point to our listeners. But other than that, we should just march forward and examine one by one how Rose used her three examples to showcase, as you mentioned, the problem of dichotomic thinking, not just limited to the realm of philosophy or intellectual exercise of certain well-off thinkers, but rather we can see the same problem manifested in a much larger scale in terms of how a society reformed itself and proposed to postulate a realm different from the so-called mundane and worldly realm in order to structure social relationships at a total and absolute level. So shall we start with French Revolution then?
Yes, of course. That's by the way, that's a very good parallel, because I think that relation between universal and particulars in this sense is gonna be that's at the core of this problem. And when we talk about the Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment figures, it seems like the Enlightenment figures want to subsume the particulars under a universal, and the counter-Enlightenment ones want to say that no subsumption under the universal is possible, because that subsumption denies the particularities of these particulars. This will come back again, and this is a good reminder that this is gonna be something at the philosophical core of this problem is gonna go back to this. One brilliant example of this problem is the problem of the French Revolution. How this tyranny of the Zolan, how this understanding of the universal as something independent from the particularities of the given society shows itself in French Revolution. Now, of course, there are so many details, historical details about the French Revolution that we don't have time to talk about it, and we don't know a lot of the details. But I think the core of the problem is very clear. And at the core of the problem will be something that is very much clear in the criticism of the counter-Enlightenment figures that we have talked about so far, in how that abstract universality becomes this devouring force that really doesn't comes at the cost of just destroying the particularities. That's what it ends up doing. So there are a couple of quotes from Rose that I think are going to be very helpful in understanding what happened in the French Revolution insofar as the problem of the tyranny of the Zolan is concerned. And one of those quotes is actually coming I believe, towards the end of the book, and it is where Rose compares the French Revolution and Marxist thinking and the revolutionary Marxist thinking. We are going to talk about Marx in the next episode on Rose, but I think that quote is going to be very useful in understanding how that is structured, how that is structured of Zolan dominating Zite exists in revolutionary thinking of the French Revolution, and also in Marxist thinking. So Rose writes that an instrumental use of a materialistic, quote unquote, theory rests, in fact, on the idealistic assumption that social reality is an object and that its definition depends on revolutionary consciousness. This is to fail to acknowledge that reality is ethical, and it is to risk recreating a terror, and reinforcing lawlessness, or strengthening bourgeois law in its universality and arbitrariness. So what Rose is saying to us here about the French Revolution, that part about the materialist idealistic side could be, we can postpone that to when we talk about Marx. But the idea is that the French Revolution, in the First Revolution, being the embodiment of important parts of Enlightenment thinking, the social reality of the French society was thought to be an object, some sort of a clay, if you wish, something that is just there to be formed, something that is just ready as something passive, so that we can bring out all of these great Enlightenment ideals and form this clay into a perfect society, right? The idea of equality, the idea of human rights, all of those fascinating, declarations and slogans and marches, they all have these Enlightenment ideas in them. Liberty, right? These are all great achievements in Enlightenment thinking. Now, what is the relation between these ideals, these correct values, right, and the social reality of the French Revolution, social reality of the French at the time of the Revolution? Well, whatever that social reality is, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what those social relations are. We have the values. We have found the values with which we can give a form to this social reality, whatever we want to. Now, there are some examples in the French Revolution that I think exemplify this type of understanding, right? For instance, let's get rid of the calendar. That calendar doesn't make any sense. We can create a calendar out of nowhere, and that calendar is actually, quote unquote, reasonable. This is the one that we have come up with. This is the one that it's not arbitrary. This is the one that we can identify with. Temples, churches, let's get rid of them. Let's curb them. Let's create temples of reason. Now, reason is dominating. Forget about all of those traditions that we had. It doesn't matter. We've got the answer. The answer is in this standard that we have, coming from all sorts of thinkers' viewpoints and all sorts of ideas present at the time of the revolution. We have this standard. Let's apply it. Let's apply it to the social reality that is just passive. And if it's not passive, then we will make it passive, right? And that's the part that I think is also terrifying and fascinating and interesting about something like the French Revolution. Because what happens in this relationship that here is not so much embellished as a moral perspective, it's more sophisticated in some ways. It has all sorts of elements of, social institutions, all of that ideas are there. But this ideal, this standard, which is allegedly legitimate, independent from anything that exists in the social fabric of France, what this basically does is that okay, you have the right to impose any form on this other, and the other also should be passive. If it's not passive, make it passive, pacify it, because it shouldn't be. It shouldn't have a voice in this, because we have the right answers. Now, when you go and try to actually do that, when you actually try to apply this standard that is legitimate, independent from the social relations, two very major things happens. One is the abstractness of those values and a standard itself becomes very clear, that how empty they were in thought that everyone is equal. That's just equality is where we should go. Everyone has the same right. Yes, everyone has the same right, but that sentence, that commandment, disregards all the nuances that exist in making sense of that claim itself. And once you start to apply that, then suddenly you have to face something more than a slogan. You have to do something. Now, that abstractness of this human beings are rational entities, reason should be in charge, all of that stuff, it starts to be far less clear of what it means that reason should be in charge. The second thing that happens is that, and this is all, by the way, inspired by how Rose incorporates Hegel's understanding of French Revolution, is that you want the other, the French revolutionaries want the other, which is the social relations existing in the French society, to be absolutely passive and irrelevant. What they do not understand is that these social relations are going to react. They're not passive at all. What the family structure in the French society is at the time is going to react to these ideals that they are becoming actual in this weird and confusing and conflicting ways a lot of times. That's going to react. That social relation is not going to sit there. And because the French revolutionaries are already disregarding any meaningful contribution from that social reality, what happens is that they want to just make it passive. How do you make something that doesn't want to be passive? Violence, right? And this is another quote from Rose. These cultures, the reformations, here she's talking more generally, but French Revolution is part of this, that these cultures, these reformations, become more violent and extreme, for the greater the opposition between reality and consciousness, the greater the violence of their enforced unity. If the social reality is, according to the French revolutionaries, nothing but what consciousness, this enlightened consciousness, brings to it, then the social reality must be passive. Now, if it's not passive and it's not acting as this clay that is ready to be reformed, we will force it. We will force it. That just means, that doesn't mean that our standards are wrong, the French revolutionaries said. That just means that, there are this kind of backward thinkings in the society, right? There are these remnants of this ancient regime that we need to get rid of. And the more this pathological relationship continues, if here sociopolitical power also has, been bestowed upon the revolutionaries, then all you have is the cycle of violence. Cycle of violently trying to enforce the unity by imposing a Sollen, here the Enlightenment ideals, on the Sitte that you want to consider as something that is absolutely passive. There are other repercussions that are related to this story, but I'm going to stop here. Let me see what Trent has to say, and then I might add something at the end to this conversation about French Revolution. Yes, Trent.
Yes, I just want to make a connection between what you just said and the overarching frame of today's episode, namely the problem of dichotomic thinking. Let's take the French Revolution visionaries as an example. They're basically coming up with a blueprint of the society, and through introducing a fascinating dichotomy inside the society itself. So the society is separated into two chunks. One is the pure consciousness, embodies reason, values, enlightenment, ideas, the idealist approach, which, if you take a holistic view of the society, are not separable from the society itself. But further, it made a very interesting move by using that to purify or petrified perhaps a set of ideas and worked on the society itself. And we see here this dichotomy is assumed, and it was never demonstrated and was never subjected to reconsideration despite the persistent resistance, reaction, the thinkers or the so-called structure encountered when they're trying to apply their ideals in a universal way, regardless of the differences and nuances in any given situation. So again, we see the connection between dichotomic thinking and the tyranny of Zolan. The passive and active images of the society, the backward-looking ancient regime ideas or customs versus the progressive enlightened reasons. Those dichotomies were introduced by the very people who were considering their ideas that were reasonable and result of a human rationality without even demonstrating or arguing for, because it was assumed and never subject to reconsideration or modification. That's the first thing. Second thing I want to point out is what is the institution, what is the social infrastructure this social experience, the French Revolution, was relying upon to translate the ideas into social action. And in my eyes, it is the state. And there's a very interesting, that quote you spotted as absolutely brilliant, page 167, that the wider the gap between, say, ideals and reality, because dichotomy assumed and introduced and enforced, the more violence the society must call for. And since the instrument or the institution they relied upon to enforce their ideas, the state, that and the result of implementing such ideas through violence, there's an intimate relationship between state and violence, which is typical Weberian definition of the state. So I think the perhaps either Kantian idea or Enlightenment idea in the 18th century, or say this specific example of French Revolution, really anticipated or conditioned 20th century social thinking or social sociology in specific as a development. They're looking back to this misguided and to a certain extent successful and unreflective social movement and abstracted an essence out of it and make it the universal category we should use to understand and implement any new ideas. So in terms, so the 21st century sociology discipline based on Rousseau critique is perhaps precisely such a bastard son or daughter of the failed social activity or action and the lofty and uncorruptible social ideas, as it was the case in French Revolution. But then we are using the abstraction of such failed experiments to guide our future social action. So it becomes a self-fulfilling and perpetuating loop. Some random thought. Back to you.
So I have a question about what the last point that you said. In what sense we are, you think, in the sociological thinking, perpetuating that dichotomy by not realizing the origin of the dichotomy? Like, in what sense, the last sentence that you said, I want to make sure if I understand that.
Right. I came up with this on the spot, so it might
Yeah.
be wrong, but I'm thinking through. For instance, in contemporary theories of the state, the concept of violence is taken as granted. State is to monopolize, sanction, and then sanction violence. But that identification or correlation was drawn upon empirical evidences from social experiments, such as the French Revolution. And those social experiments started with the uncorrectable assumption between Zeta and Zolan, and the only viable way for them to pacify the descending waste through the use of violence, which by no means was necessarily the only way to say do community or to implement one's ideas in a society, but it was demonstrated in such a vivid and a detailed way that, to a certain extent, once you're in that Kantian or new Kantian trend, contemplating different ideas and arguing with the people with the different ideas that eventually collapsed into and reinforces that dichotomic thinking. That because all the examples you see that were already, to a certain extent, corrupted by that dichotomic thinking.
I see. That's brilliant. That's very interesting. So this idea, this dominant idea that state and violence come together in terms of a state is there to enforce certain norms or laws upon the citizens, and there is resistance, that relationship between the state and the individuals, for instance. That idea that the state is that is very much indebted to this pronounced empirical data that we have, which is the French Revolution, in which the state became exactly that. The state became the violent enforcer of some norms onto a society that wasn't responsive to it to a very good extent. And what is happening in this transmission of or use of the example of the French Revolution is that it becomes more than an example. It becomes something about some sort of a judgment about what a state is. So we are trapped in this understanding of a state as something necessarily violent, or this kind of a pathological relationship between the state and the citizens, not because there is a fundamental conflict necessarily between the state and the citizens that needs violence, but because this Enlightenment example of the French Revolution is dominant. We have universalized on an example that is very much pronounced in our understandings. Yeah.
We universalized upon a particular that presumed a universal dichotomy between, say, the state and the people. And violence is the most of the natural way for the two to interact.
I see. So in that sense, the event of the French Revolution, combined with its intellectual counterpart in the Kantian and New Kantian thinking, has reinforced this idea of the state as the violent, as the one that enforces, as the one that brings laws to unwilling citizens, and has a thought of that as the standard way to think about the state.
And I'll follow up, it just come to my mind. The reason this myth making was so successful and dominant is because that it was, on one hand, championed by those pro-Enlightenment thinkers, like the heirs of Kant. But the more interesting part, it was also taken up by counter-Enlightenment thinkers in their non-political view of what is against the state, for instance, the folk, the people. They started to ignore the political or violent dimensional potential of those categories like Herder. For him, popularism people had nothing to do with the state as a violence dispensing machine, which is precisely assuming and receiving the unquestioned dichotomy introduced by Enlightenment thinking in the first place. So even we have dialogues or confrontations or critiques that are from seemingly different positions, but this introduced dichotomy was never questioned in their argumentation. So that becomes, of course, the starting point, no matter which camp you belong to. That's why I think the relationship between French Revolution and Marxist thinking is really evident, because for Marxist thinker, they introduced perhaps their precursors, but the most famous for introducing or reinforcing the dichotomy between the materialist thinking and idealist thinking. And no matter whether you are an idealist or a materialist, and arguing for your position, you are enforcing that absolute dichotomy between the two, even though the two, if you look at a society as a general or as an individual, as a minimal unit of interaction, the two are not separable, but we assume they are separate. One last thing, briefly, and we can probably move on, is this is by no means unique to sociology. Same thing happened with, say, economy. That economics 101 started with how, if a sociology 101 starts with the state formation theory, then economics 101 perhaps starts with the money theory. And they are imagining an evolution of economy from, say, bartering to the use of money, which is only empirically demonstrable in a society with extensive use of money itself. Similarly, in a society where, say, coins or money were not available, people never did barter in the same way economists envisioned they did. So they are just like a social theorists, political thinkers who are imagining pre-French Revolution states based on the image of French Revolution, the concept of state or abstraction of state. They are using a post-industrialized so-called modern economy to imagine say, Enlightenment or pre-industrial economies. And therefore, you never get out of that presumption, the difference between, say, state and people, the difference between, say, money and real utilities or values in commodities. So just a shout out. Of course, we can do the same critique for virtually every social science discipline, but our time is limited. Let's just move.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, and I think it's very important in the sense that it's going to be related to the last point I want to mention about the French Revolution, and this problem is going to exist in other shapes of the tyranny of the soul that we're going to talk about. So basically what happens, based on what you said, is that, like, think about economics or other social sciences, whenever we attempt to come up with a universal account of how, for instance, economic relations work out, right? Let's abstract from everything, right? Let's go to this buffered place, that in that buffered place, we're going to find the relations. We're going to find the correct picture. The more we deny the relevance of the existing social relations in how they shape that quote-unquote universal account that we come up with in terms of, for instance, economic conditions, the more we deny the relevance of that information, the more we are trapped in it,
right?
In understanding others. And I think that's one of the main things that Rose mentions, that Hegel thinks is happening with, especially with Kant. But I have the last quote of the French Revolution that we will see that here too. But when we get to Kant, we will have even a better view of how this plays out. So Rose writes in 174 that the revolution was the denial of a lawless feudal order, not the reality of a different property relation. It means it didn't provide any alternative. It was just the denial of it. The revolution was the act of a pure consciousness which did not acknowledge any reality outside the self, anything ethical life, and perverted by the lawlessness which is sought to abolish. So this also was true in the quote that I started with, that it is not just about the risk of recreating a terror, but in 220, it is also the risk of reinforcing lawlessness or strengthening the bourgeois law in its universality and arbitrariness, which means that French Revolution is borrowing certain aspects of its society without really understanding that it's borrowing them, and it gets mixed up with that quote-unquote ahistorical universal values, but that distinction never becomes clear. So this becomes a hypocritical standpoint that both wants to be absolutely universal and think about the existing social reality, as something that doesn't matter, but at the same time, it needs all of those existing social relations to make sense of itself as this ideal. Without that context, it just loses its meaning. But with that, in that problem, I think it's going to become more clear when we talk about Kant. But before moving to Kant, let's talk about another example, which is also fascinating, that Rose focuses on as the exemplar of the tyranny of the Zolan, and that's Christianity, right? So the way that Rose describes this, and I'm not quite sure that how Hegel approached this. Is this more Rose than Hegel? There are parts of this is definitely Hegel, but I'm not sure how much of it is this coming from Rose, is that Christianity, in a similar fashion, in a completely different social conditions, thought of itself in abstraction from all the existing ethical norms and understood itself in opposition to the given ethical structure or police that it was part of, which is the Roman Empire. So the way that Christianity, according to Rose, structured itself has the exact same pattern that we have been talking about from the beginning of this episode. Thinking of the standard as something universal that is buffered from and indifferent to the existing social relations. The universal of action, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, is not necessarily something that is about the society that we're part of or the society that early Christians were part of. It's just independent from those. And the only thing that we could do is to reject, like bring this standard to the social relations and use it as this kind of a hammer, like to just destroy the parts that do not fit this standard. Now, of course, this Christian morality could take many shapes. It could itself become a force of the state, right? It could itself become something of that nature, which is itself a fascinating story. But in its opposition, it always stays at this pathological relation with the ethical social relations, because it can do nothing other than asserting itself as the dominant over the other, but also witnessing that the other has the power. Like think about the early Christians, like before the Christians got the power. What is that relationship? That relationship is not there to even reform. Like it's about saying that whatever exists as the ethical relations in this society is not legitimate. Even if it is quote unquote right, it is only right because it happens to be fitted into the Christian doctrine. So the relationship that exists between the Christian morality as this Zolen and the Sitte is the relationship of dominance of subsumption. Now, when the dominance of subsumption is coming from the position of the inferior, the actual reality of what happens is going to be different when the power is granted to that Zolan. And that's one interesting contrast between early Christianity and the French Revolution. The French Revolution wasn't just, Rousseau thinking about reason, Voltaire talking about reason. It wasn't in that inferior position of not being part of the political power, but it became the political power, and that's how it acted. Now, early Christianity wasn't in that position, but the energy is the same. The energy, the reference to the social relations is at least very similar. And the quote that I want to mention here from Rose is the one that she mentions, she quotes from the Bible itself, but gives us an introductory sentence, which says, Jesus foresaw the full horror of this fate, of this relationship between Christianity and the state, that it meant destruction, not reconciliation. And this is a quote from the Bible. I came not to bring peace on earth, but a sword. I came to set the son against his father, the daughter against her mother, the bride against her husband's kin. So these relations, what are these relations? Sitte, ethical life. What am I bringing is not any sort of recognition, Jesus is saying, of the validity of these relations. What I'm bringing is the sword. What I'm bringing is the value standard that is not standing in harmony with this, or in conversation even with this Roman society. I'm ignorant about the relationship between the early Christians and the Roman society, but from what I know about how Christianity presented itself, it doesn't look like that the Christians were thinking that, okay, no, Romans are also contributing to the standard of what it means to be good. No, the standard was the Christian standard. Romans were not invited in that conversation, in the sense that the Romans were invited in conversation if they were there for conversion. That was the conversation. The conversation is about conversion. The conversation is not about the recognition of the legitimacy of the other in changing anything about that original position, which takes us back to the whole basic idea about the relationship between Zolan and Sitte. The problem is not that there is a Zolan. The problem is that the Zolan cannot be reconsidered based on the Sitte. Right? The Zolan wants to stubbornly be in charge of this dominance in this relationship without really giving any chance to this other to contribute to what that the standard is. So if you're thinking about this in the sense of a standard for action, right? What is the right way to act? What is the good way to act? We can think about this probably more clearly. The Christian thinking is not thinking of the Roman society as in any way in the position of contributing anything positive to what that standard is. And that is nothing but picturing the Zolan, establishing the Zolan, that here is the Christian morality as the dominant, as the one that must devour and cannot do anything else to the Roman relations, the Roman social relations, then devour them and to subsume them under itself. And there are two different things that Rose mentions in addition to what I just said about Christianity in this story, that both of them I think very interesting. So one thing that happens in Christianity, and that's not what happens in French Revolution, is that there is this freedom at its core becomes something non-worldly, right? Freedom is not something that could be achieved as a, human beings are going to be evil, the social relations are going to be rotten, there is going to be all of these problems, and we can go on and try to purify and try to save people, and have that kind of a relationship. But ultimate freedom cannot come. We cannot see the fruit of that relationship, that freedom in the societal structure, which with this point that Rose mentions around page 167, I'm not sure if this is accurate with respect to Christian thinkers of later times that thought of, what is the whole idea with the city of God? Like, isn't that something about actually establishing that social relation? But even if that part is the case, right, this freedom is not just postponed. The freedom could be achieved to an extent, at least, on Earth. Then we're back to the structure of the French Revolution. The only way that the city of God could be established is to deny the relevance of existing social relations and imposing the standard that has a completely different source as the standard and try to form it as if it's a clay. And again, all the violence of this that comes out of this distinction. The final thing that I'm going to mention, and then it's yours, Tran, is the quote from Rose that I really like. And I'm not sure if I'm understanding it the way I understand it because I want to understand it the way I understand it, or actually that's how she thinks. But the quote is this. It's about Christians. Their love was to remain love and not become life. And this is actually a quote directly from Hegel. So what I understand from this quote is that idea of love is very present in the Christian thinking, and the idea of loving your neighbor, for instance, is a very, repeated commandment of how you should act in the world. But from what I understand from this quote, there is a problem with this love, because this love is not reacting to, not that it's not reacting, it's not thinking of the ethical relations as the end goal or as something that is worthy of exploring and maybe reforming. The love remains a moral love that does not find its path towards any real social reconstruction. This is probably feeling very good in this interpretation, feels really good to me because we are living in the United States. And I think that's a very, very clear way that the love remains love and it doesn't become life from the dominant Christian forces in the society. There are a lot of Christians, a lot of powerful Christians in the States, and they might be very genuine in terms of even expressing that love in different one-to-one relations with others, right? But what is absolutely missing is that where is this love when it comes to financial institutions, right? When it becomes like, when it goes to the actual existing social relations of property laws, for instance, does the love permeate that level? Or the love is just about, I see a poor peasant and I, pity him or help him in this, charity, right? It becomes something like charity. I think that will be something that is, to me, is still a lifeless love, a love that does not reach the social fabric. It becomes something quite different from a love that finds its way in the social institutions. But this is just, let's think of this as the way that I want to interpret this quote, more than just what the quote is. But the main problem, the main structure, independent from this quote, is going to be the same. That Christianity is a moral religion, according to Rose's reading of Hegel. And this morality of this religion reinforces a structure that we have been talking about, the dominance relationship between the Sollen and the Sitten.
Oh, yes, I really like your interpretation, even though I'm not really sure in what context that Hegel used the sentence in the first place.
Yeah.
But that's a very appealing one. My take of that quote, I don't know the context, but now that I know my conversation, I think my way of understanding is the love postulated is modeled after, say, Jesus' self-sacrifice, that kind of love, is not realistic, is by definition not realistic. And life has to be pragmatic and realistic. Therefore, this ideal, this paragon of and Christian virtue will be corrupted if it's complying or acceding to the social convention or social expectations. Therefore, ideals can only remain pure if it is buffered and separated from zeta or the existing ethical way of life. But never mind, that's just some random thought. I have 2 points to make before we move on to your no doubt brilliant interpretation of Kant. One is you mentioned the concept of conversion, which I think is really interesting, because what, say, the early Christians, or not, this is of course a contextual reading, several centuries development, and we're trying to come up with an ideal type for it. Ignore the anachronistic in terms of technical terms, it doesn't matter. Let's just say Christianity spread in the Roman Empire in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century CE. What they were trying to convert people to is not just a different religion per se. It's like Hegel's critique of Kantian method. It's not just that specific method. It's a very definition of method itself. Similarly, Christianity's conversion is converting so-called pagans or idol worshippers or the cult worshippers into a completely different category of religion, which took the absolute dichotomy between the worldly and the religious or the sacred as granted, which was not there really in the Roman religious practices. So, as you mentioned, city of God was used by Augustine in contradiction to the city of men, the kingdom of God in contradiction to the kingdom of men. So that absolute dichotomy was very much, I think, Rose's or Hegel's identification used that as an example. It's absolutely brilliant, and that is the foundation behind its so-called its proposed social revolution. It's by introducing a separation which was not there, was not even imaginable in the society beforehand, which is similar perhaps to what the French Revolution did to the European imagination of what the state really is in relationship to the society. And then it ate up the whole realm of discourse about what a religion really is, what it is, the state really is. We are still living in the legacy of these two. We're still approaching, say, Buddhism, Islam, whatever religious practice, whichever pitfall, with a prefabricated notion of the very concept of religion, which is absolutely individual, particular, and contingent, but we assume it to be universal. Similarly, this kind of state will try to say, oh, why Afghanistan is a failed state? Because it does not match to the French Revolution definition of the state, but it didn't mean it's a failed state at their own standard. If people did not want a centralization, then perhaps their tribal organization or decentralized or could have set all kinds of centrifugal ceremonies, power dynamics were very successful to get what they want. It's just that they failed our standard, which we assume to be the standard. Okay, so one more thing before we move on to Kant is here, as like what I did for last slide, that the social institution or infrastructure that turned a set of ideas or assumptions, pure consciousness basically, into political revolution. In the case of the French Revolution, was the unit of the state, and in this case, it was religion, and the state was connected with the concept of violence. That's the way we try to bridge the gap introduced. And here is love. We try to use Jesus' love to bridge the absolute gap we introduced. And to a certain extent, these two are very comparable units, social units, or social way of abstracting, and you first introduce absolute dichotomy, which was not foreseeable in the existing society. Then you try to bridge them through dominance and subsumption. I think that is the core or essence of the problem of the dichotomic thinking and the tyranny of the Zolan, which I think has counterpart or even more concrete and more influential parallel in our concept of perhaps individuality and moral agency, as Kant talks about in his writing. Would you take us there, please?
Yeah, this is the parallels that you made are just beautiful to me. That the same problem that you mentioned about the state in French Revolution happens with religion. Like the role that French Revolution plays in our understanding of, in our presupposition of what a state should be, the same problem happens with Christianity in our understanding of what a religion should be. And yeah, it will be interesting to see how Hegel himself, that is very much aware of the necessity of this, French state makes sense not because of some ideals, but because of some existing social relations there. When he starts talking about religion, like how he deals with this problem, I think it's going to be interesting whenever we get into that part of Hegel's philosophy. That would be interesting. But also thinking of love and violence as two sides of the same coin, in bridging two different sides that they're originally opposite, they're originally distinct, and that distinction is not going anywhere. No. What could put them together is either violence or love, or violent love in a combination.
Lovely violence.
Or lovely violence. So the last part of the last example is going to be something that we have focused on, where Rose's focus seemed to be on that the most, which is Kantian morality. So far, I think we have made it clear what a structure we are dealing with when we are thinking about this dominance of Zolan over ethical relations. But I think it will be helpful, because Kant is at the center place of this whole discussion, to briefly clarify what this Kantian morality is all about, and what kind of problems it tries to solve, and what kind of structure it ends up presupposing. Now, one thing is that, again, in the sense of what Kant's motivation of providing this standard of morality is very much in the understood in the context of Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment era, right? Let's not forget that someone like Hamann, as one of the great counter-Enlightenment figures, were in touch with Kant, and in a weird way that I cannot fathom, they were kind of friends too. But so Kant is part of this zeitgeist. Now, what Kant is trying to do, and he does that in a theoretical part of his system and the practical side the same, is to come up with a solution to the problem of relationship between universals and particulars. That's what he is doing in the theoretical reason in different ways, and also in the practical reason in a different way. So here are the sides that we have. One side is the pre-Kantian Enlightenment, let's call it rationalist tradition, right? That thinks about humanity as having some sort of a common core, right? And that common core is something that brings out the concept of rights, brings out the concept of what is valuable, right? In order to see what is objectively valuable, we need to abstract from the differences of the particular human societies or particular human beings, and come up with a universal standard that encompasses all of us in this, abstract from the particulars, what we are at the core. Let's find that, and then we can have then a standard for action. right? Now, this could also take a more practical turn in terms of, finding that common core in terms of what we care for. And later on, not only during the, before Kant, after Kant as well, in people like thinkers like Mill, this, for instance, shows itself in the dominance of the idea of utility, right? That, okay, as human beings, what we care for is utility. Now we can relax. We have found the basic principle of evaluation by human beings, and we look around different societies. We see that different societies are just looking for utility. Now, the clear problem with this approach is that one is very much empirically, rooted in empirical data, and two, the empirical data does not really fit this idea. The only way that it fits is to turn this idea of utility into something so empty that it cover anything, right? Because if you're thinking about utility in the industrialized Britain, that has nothing to do with the utility in the Maya cult. It's the Indian tribes of the Cherokee did not have the same understanding of utility. Now, if you are thinking about, utility becomes something empty. That's what I'm saying. It's that it becomes something that is not really explaining anything. It is just forced there to present some quote unquote universal approach of humanity. Like the utility of the ancient tribes of Africa, the way that they understood utility compared to 21st century Germany, will be translated into something that, they were looking for something, we are looking for something. It just becomes as abstract as that. As soon as you start thinking about, okay, this utility means like pleasure, then it's out. It's the whole situation is different, right? That's what happens to utilitarianism. Utilitarianists, they said, okay, what is utility then? Utility is the maximum gap between pleasure and pain, right? But that is not something universal at all. It's not universal in the human society, human beings living in the modern Western societies. That is not at all the concept of utility as anything shared. So it is imposing something half empirical, half rational as something universal that should be applied to everyone. So that will be one side of the problem. The other side of the problem, which is, let's call it, for the sake of argument here, the rationalist one. But by rationalist, I don't mean rationalist in the sense of like Descartes rationalist, by saying that what is rational to value, that kind of a question. So that kind of universalization seems to be forced, but the other side doesn't seem very exciting either. It just turns out to this kind of a nihilistic relativism that there is no value at all. There's just, speaking of values, speaking of a standard becomes something vacuous on its own if we give in to the diversity of the particulars, which could have all sorts of troubles of its kind. What Kant is trying to say is to do what he always does, to look for the necessary conditions. That's all, that's what he does, and that's what he's good at to a good extent. So what Kant says is that, okay, empirically, like finding some sort of a value, that doesn't work out. Thinking about that half empirically valid value and, give it some sort of a rational twist, that's not going to work out. This kind of a particular fascination with the particulars is not going to work out. What we need to do is to ask us these questions. Is a given fact that there are vastly different particularized human societies and particularized human beings. What we need to do is to see what is making it possible for these societies to even start to have different value standards. How is that diversity itself possible? Right? That's a very Kantian approach, if I want to put it more abstractly, you ask, how is diversity possible? And the answer to that would be some sort of a unity. Unless there is some sort of a unity, this diversity cannot be possible, right? And that's exactly what he does with, the evident fact that there are all sorts of value standards. He wants to say that all of these value standards are possible because we're human beings. And what it takes to be a human being is to be an agent. So the reason that the Mayas could have this type of value standard, and the Germans of the 18th century, this other value standard, the Iranians of the 21st century, this other value standard, is coming from agency. Agency as at the core of all of these diversity. This desire to have an identity goes hand in hand with agency. Now, Kant says to establish, and here we kind of come back to the original discussion, to establish what is the correct value standard for the sentient beings that we are, we do not need to really look at the diversity of these value expressions. Whatever they are, they're all conditioned on agency. If they're conditioned on agency, all we need to do is to see what it takes to be an agent in a coherent and consistent way. With that, we are going to satisfy this basic human need, basic human nature. And of course, they can get things wrong in different societies, right? But what goes wrong in those societies is something that leaves us less satisfied. So let me give the listeners an example of what I mean by this kind of a satisfaction. So this is not something that Kant would have said, but I think it's going to help. So think about human beings in terms of like having a human body, right? Having these types of organs. There are all sorts of different bodies, right? But now think about the concept of health. Health is something that is about establishing a relationship between these organs in their differences in all of that. There are some stuff that are healthy for the human body, right? Satisfy the need of being healthy. Now, depending on where we are, the particular answers and questions about health will change. But we can think about a science of health that establishes what it means to be healthy, physically speaking, for human beings, that is not in denial of the different, diverse aspects of human existence, but it has a structure that will incorporate all of those things within itself. If I am not healthy, or if a society is not healthy in a physical sense, something is not being satisfied from this Kantian perspective. Something, like there is a need, the very basic need of human being to self-preserve and go on being, that becomes disrupted when we are not eating healthy, we're not drinking healthy, right? So there is something basic about being a human being and being healthy. That doesn't mean that human beings cannot be unhealthy. Of course they can be, but when they are denying something basic about what it means to be a human being, which means what it means to be this organism, be a functioning organism, right? So by no means Kant denies that the basic, so agency is a basic human need. It's something that needs satisfaction, the same way that we need to have food. We need to satisfy our agency, according to Kant. Agency is not something that we can just do without. Of course, we could, but in the same way that we could stop eating. We could, but something just goes wrong fundamentally about who we are. So we should all go back to what it takes to be an agent to find the satisfaction. Just like we go back to the question of what it means to be healthy, and then we by analyzing that, we can then go back to the particular instances of, okay, this person's kidneys enlarged, this other person's heart has this little flaw, right? But like we know what it means to be a healthy human being. So based on these particularities of the situation, we will solve it. Now, of course, I'm presenting this health analogy to fit the Kantian picture. I'm doing that willingly. That doesn't mean that the health sciences is working that way. But the idea, I'm trying to make a parallel between something in that area and the Kantian picture. So when we get to know what it means to be an agent, we have found the way to act as human beings. Now we can go back to that particular instances of human action and determine whether they are right or wrong. The same way that we have to have a conception of what is healthy, then we could go back and pass judgments about whether this person's kidneys function well or not. We need to have an idea of what it means to function well as an organism. Then we can go and pass judgments. Now we can have like a very, awkward understanding of what it means to be a, functioning organism. But what is needed is to really delve in and see what it takes to be healthy. And with that coherent conception, we can then go back to the particulars. So what Kant does is to say that satisfaction of agency comes from very simple thing, acting as an agent. And acting as an agent basically just means to not make yourself an exception, to be able to universalize what you do for every other agent. So anyone that was in your position, if anyone was in your position, you were in another position, you should be able to admit that must happen, that could happen, right? So there are two different levels in this analysis. So to act as an agent is to not make an exception of myself. That means that whatever I do, I must be able to universalize that action. Universalizing action means that anyone in my position must be able to do what I do without any contradiction arising. And, in this sense, and everything becomes transparent in this scenario. So let me just give you an example, and then we can just go back to the discussion. The example would be something like lying, right? If I lie to Tren,
Yes, you do.
Which I do a lot. If Kant comes in and says that, okay, let's see, that's an action, right? Let's see if that action makes sense. Let's see if that is correct. The way I determine the correctness of this is not about utility. It's not about like the customs in the society. Not at all. What I do is this, that, okay, let's think of myself as an agent and universalize and make this action absolutely transparent, right? Meaning that everyone is in the know. Imagine that whenever I lie, there is like some like orange taint is on my hair. Everyone will know. Trend will know. Everyone will know. And ask yourself, could you achieve what you wanted to achieve in this new world? That it's everyone in your condition will lie, and everyone will know that they are lying. Everyone who is lying in the society for a specific purpose, everyone will know that they're lying, right? Could they achieve their purpose? No, they can't. Because if I'm lying to others, what I'm doing is that I'm hiding something, because hiding it guarantees me getting something. So there is a contradiction. I cannot achieve my purpose if this is universalized and transparent. And because of that, this action is not moral. So in this example, simple example, Kant wants to say, I didn't go look for like what are the ethical norms and social and political institutions of United States in the 21st century. I didn't tell you lie to Tren in China or in Iran or in the US or in Pakistan. I just thought about this as lying in general, right? So lying in general to achieve, a purpose, like I lie to you that I can pay back the money that you are lending me, right? Which I know that I'm not going to pay back to you, right? That act, independent of any social relations, is morally wrong. And what matters when it comes to that action is that action is morally wrong. Whether in the ethical norms of a society, that activity is considered fine, right? Or Trent in this particular situation doesn't care if I'm lying or not paying it back. Like all of those emotions and desires and particularities about this scenario, put them aside. Doesn't matter. All that matters is that moral standard that is applied to that structure. So now we have the time. It's the time for us to come back to the structure that we're talking about it. So in this sense, there are two types of dichotomic thinking, two types of oppositions that exist. One is morality and ethical life, and the other is morality and nature. And by nature, I mean desires, for instance, impulses. That's not part of the equation at all for Kant. Being an agent is standing above all of the desires. So it doesn't matter how much, like I need that money from Trent to feed my kid who is dying. That doesn't matter at all in that scenario. What matters is that lying is wrong. So it has nothing to do with nature, with even like the causal world, the causal nexus of stuff, desires, impulses. None of them are invited, and also it has nothing to do with ethical relations and the social relations that are existing. Its validity and legitimacy is beyond that. So the morality is dominating and subsuming nature and ethical relations under itself. And that's exactly the kind of a structure that we've been talking about, right? And this structure, again, recreates all the problems that we discussed in both French Revolution and Christianity as the moral religion. In this denial, a couple of things happen. One thing that happens that we didn't talk about in French Revolution morality and Christianity may be true in the case of Christianity, but in the case of Kant, it's more evident. Kant wants this to be absolutely rational, but he faces all sorts of troubles in doing this. One is, like, for instance, if my desires, and let's call the satisfaction of my desires independent from my agency in the Kantian picture, something like happiness, right? If my happiness and satisfaction of my needs is something absolutely irrelevant to my moral nature and my agency, then it seems like that this gap is a problem. It's if I have no motivation to live, then I cannot even be in the position of being moral. If I am so unsatisfied in my desires that I'm not even in the position of being an agent, right? But agency is not satisfying. Agency is not about satisfying happiness. So what is with these two things that seems to be part of my nature as a human being? Here is a time for postulates. Here is a time which is said, oh, okay, these things these are originally distinct. There's no way that we can talk about them together. We cannot, really put them, together in a system unless we have a postulate. That postulate would say that, happiness and agency, happiness and morality eventually find their way together. They converge. You will find your satisfaction at the end. You will find your happiness at the end. By the way, something interesting and kind of funny about Hegel's phenomenology when he's repudiating this viewpoint, this whole idea of postulates, that Hegel thinks in a very Nietzschean way that this ideal of convergence, this postulate of convergence, is an envious convergence of the unhappy, quote unquote, moral people, that they are not enjoying their lives. So, but they want to say, no, at the end, I'm going to have the happiness. Now you are having fun, but that fun is not what matters. What matters is that this end point, that me, the moral, I, the moral, will get the final happiness, which is, again, very maybe Christian or Islamic perspective too, in terms of the satisfaction, the happiness is going to, in heaven, it's going to be all there. God, in the same way, is introduced into Kant's system. God is not a rational entity. It's not like something that could be understood rationally. It's just a postulate. So we end up having all of these postulates to bring these oppositions together, further overcoming the gap between different entities. But this is the last thing I'm going to say about Kant's morality and how it is related to the whole discussion, and then it's yours, Tran, is that we have all the problems with this viewpoint that we had with French Revolution and Christianity. And again, in Kant, the difference between Kant and I surmise that Hegel would say that Kant, if there were ever a Kantian revolution that expressed itself at the level of political stage, it would be as horrific and violent as the French Revolution, because the suffering is the same suffering. One, the suffering is to make sense of these commandments, right? These values, these duties. You have no other choice other than bringing the context in, right? And two, because you are not bringing the context in explicitly, you're actually presupposing the very basic facts of it as absolutely true. One example that Hegel himself emphasizes is that there is no contradiction in a world without private property. In fact, private property itself is something contradictory, as Rose keeps mentioning. Private property has that kind of self-exclusion in it. But the world without private property, there is no intellectual, purely rational contradiction in imagining a world that doesn't have private property. But Kant seems to have a very strong problem with anything that disregards private property. Where did that come from, other than the 18th century Königsberg? Like, where did that come from, other than the actual existing social relations in the society? So not only this test of morality from this Hegelian perspective requires all sorts of details that include all sorts of contexts, right? Because, if we say, for instance, lying in general, well, lying in general is very broad. What if Tran is a Nazi and my lying is saving humanity? Like, what is that situation? What happens if we add all sorts of little details to these stories, which is where things happen? Like, I never lie generally. I lie in a particular circumstance. But look what Kant asks you to do. Kant asks you to abstract from all of those particularities and think about lying in this kind of a broad general sense. What made my lying in this specific way was because of all of those particular contexts that were in place between me and this specific social relation that I have with this other person, all the other aspects of the characters involved in this story. So without those social contexts, this commandment itself is empty as the French Revolution's commandment of equality, as liberty. When it wants to translate into the social relations, it becomes something quite different than what it was. And also, it is about reaffirming the existing social relations that this whole moral ideal, this moral freedom, should be standing above it. So the quotes that I have put here, one is about the point about the lack of identity and the unjust property relations, reconfirming the unjust property relations. And I will just read the last part of it, which Rose attributes to both Kant and Fichte, their idea of freedom. And she says, this ideal of freedom, Kant's and Fichte's, or unity, denies real relations and hence fixes them. It cannot transform real relations. It can only injure them. With that, I will stop, and I want to see what you have to say, Trent, and if there is anything, I will respond to that.
Yeah, well, you showed us a lot, and I'm still digesting. I'll start with perhaps a couple of clarifying questions. First is on the relationship with the rundown of Kantian morality and his philosophical system, and how what concrete absolute dichotomies did he introduce and then take as granted. I think you mentioned it. Can you repeat it again so that I can put my thought together? Yes.
Yeah. So those absolute oppositions exist at different levels. First level that I didn't explicitly mention, but it is very important, is about freedom and the realm of causality, the causal nexus of the world of physics, for instance. So Kant thinks that morality happens at the level of freedom, and there is something like its own domain of morality, which is where we are free agents. That's where it happens, the normative space, right? And there is a descriptive space of the physics of the world, right? So in the first critique, Kant establishes, or he thinks he does, that we can never come up with an answer about this dichotomy between freedom and necessity, freedom and the causal nexus of the world, right? We assume everything is causal, we arrive at freedom. We assume freedom exists, we arrive as causal, right? So this is itself something that theoretical reason cannot really resolve, this conflict. And these domains are going to remain separated, severed from one another throughout the end. So this has whole consequences about, like, okay, if freedom is happening in this other realm that is not about like the physical world in the usual sense of it, what does it mean for me to be moral in the world if this world is the world of causally connected entities? Like, how these two get connected? This if there is this absolute opposition between the two, how are these synchronized? And Kant's answer to that is extremely wacky. But the same kind of opposition exists with morality and nature, in terms of morality and my desirous side, which we can think about as, if we are thinking about as more like value-based, morality and happiness. Happiness is about satisfaction of desires and impulses, and morality is about the satisfaction of agency. And there is an opposition between them. And there is no convergence in a realistic way. They're going to remain separate. It's an oil and water, right? They're not going to come together. There is no synthesis between the two, right? And the only way that we kind of breach them is by postulates that, act morally and believe, have faith that your moral action will bring you some satisfaction. Maybe you don't lie to Trent and lose his friendship, but maybe then Trent comes back to you and appreciates that after a year, because now, he has understood the value of your integrity, right? Something like that. So it must come as some sort of a guess, not a calculation, some sort of faith, not a reasonable analysis. Okay, so morality and happiness become separated. Are agency and desires separated? Also, morality and social relations separated, which is the basic, pattern that we have been following. The Sollen and the Sitte are separated. It doesn't matter what kind of a society we're living in. The moral Sollen is always the dominant, and the distinction is always there. And Rose mentions this. This because of this, in a way, it's similar to the Christian story. There is no ending to this. You're always opposing the social structure. That's what you do, because you cannot have that kind of a fundamental reconciliation with the ethical relations.
Right. I see now. Yeah, the way you organize the dichotomic thinking of Kant into these three pairs, I find particularly helpful. But one thing strikes me a lot around is Kant seems to be particularly interested only in one side of it, namely the individual side. Freedom, morality, and agency are very well organized and defended and rationalized. But the right-hand side, especially the social practical dimension, the ethical life, I don't know. I'm not a student of Kant, but would you say it is rationalized within his own system, or is it not that important for him?
I think the implication of this whole idea of dichotomic thinking and this whole idea of relativization of one idea to the other, right, is that Kant is at the core of his argument, emphasizing on the meaning of agency and morality in denying the relevance of desires and ethical life. So part of what he's doing is that insofar as, I don't think Kant had any sort of practical problem with someone studying history, right? I don't think he found that irrelevant just in general. But insofar as the question of what is the value standard, how should we act, history doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how history has emerged. It doesn't matter how societies have been structured. Whatever has happened, we have found the answer. The answer is in this test, in this moral approach that Kant proposes. So I can understand why Kant does not pursue that. He finds, like, the point about freedom and necessity is different because he talks about necessity and the physical laws and the causality. But in the practical domain, when it comes to when the issue is about the practical domain and the concepts, the pair of concepts that are in the practical domain, like desires are practical in the general sense. They are moving us through acting in certain ways, right? It's not just about laws of physics. Or ethical life is about like the practical organization of societies. In terms of the practical domain matters, these domains do not do anything for Kant. They are not important. They are no more important than the existing social reality of French society at the time of revolution for the revolutionaries. No more important than the ethical relations existing in the Roman society for early Christians, right? Why the French revolutionaries do not study the existing social relations of their time? Why do Christians do not study the ethical relations of the Roman Empire? Because they don't care, because they don't think of that as something that could bring forward anything about values. And you can tell us more, but it seems like it has been a pattern in the post-Kantian humanities and social sciences that different thinkers have actually tried to find reason and rationality in areas that are ignored by Kant, like desires and ethical life. Do you have some examples?
Yeah, I'm not very sure that where they're from, but just at a very basic level, they are for social scientists like Max Weber. They were trying to use precisely what Kant provided for individual rationality and use that standard to account for diversity of cultures and value systems, as we can observe, there seems to a very, at a meta level, a way to construct value rationality for things like Max Weber. Basically, they are certainly aware that Kant's model is insufficient in the sense that it ignores the cultural expressions or particularities, and its system doesn't even have a space for that inquiry because it's so utterly irrelevant for how to live a good life. But their approach towards it is still, as Rose Britton points out, neo-Kantian, in the sense taking the social patterns and subdividing into different domains. So there's rationality in law, there's rationality in economy, there's rationality in religious practices, and the legacy of dichotomic thinking is basically still with us in the way we approach that. So rationality and its relationship with, say, all the social ethical life, that unbridgeable gap is still haunting all social thinkers of our time. I don't know whether Hegel has a completely different take on that problem.
I think this is actually a good point, good place to wrap this episode up, because it is Hegel raises against Kant not only because it seems to me that the way that you were describing it, some of these post-Kantian thinkers, they're not worried much about the basic intellectual commitments of Kant. They are more concerned about why Kant didn't talk about, history as much, didn't talk about society as much, right? So if your concern only is at this level, why didn't Kant talk about that? You can just go ahead and talk about it. But how you talk about it is going to be very important. I think what happens in Hegel is that two things at the same time happen. He wants to talk about these ignored aspects of the ignored side, the side that is being dominated in Kant's morality, right? Which is very clearly the ethical life. Hegel wants to talk about that, but he wants to talk about that not because Kant just forgot to talk about it, but because Kant not talking about it is the basic flaw of the Kantian system as a whole. So Hegel talking about that is going to be something, has more weight to it, because it includes this whole idea that without the analysis of the ethical life, no coherent conception of a standard of correctness, a standard of correctness for action, for instance, could be put forward, right? And next time we will talk about it's going to be the last episode on Rose's book, and we're gonna have a glimpse of what is Hegel's response, what type of a response we're looking at. Now, the details of this response is going to be extremely sophisticated and definitely beyond the reach of these episodes for now, but we're going to have an idea of how Hegel thinks the solution could pop up. And the solution to this to this dichotomy thinking in Hegel, according to Rose, presenting itself in the idea of absolute ethical life and the concept of absolute in general. And next time we're gonna explore this idea within the resource of Rose, and at the end of it, we're gonna return to the original question that we had about sociology and how sociology in the 19th, 20th, 19th till 21st century, according to Rose, has basically disregarded what Hegel calls the absolute. So
right. Yes. Thanks for listening. Stay attuned. Hegel's absolute is coming up.